Hello, students. Welcome back to Imperialism. Today, we are going to be learning about imperialism in Africa. Just as a quick review, because I know we had spring break last week, I just wanted to go over again what imperialism is. Essentially, imperialism is when larger countries, and by larger, I mean more powerful, not necessarily geographically larger, but powerful industrialized countries start taking over other smaller countries or weaker countries. And in this case, you're going to have the entire continent of Africa will be up for grabs. And one of the really interesting things about this unit is it really starts to explain why Africa kind of looks the way it does today in terms of how countries are created, some of their economic problems. We're starting to, this will be one of those puzzle pieces that kind of fits everything, starts fitting things together. So, with that said, why Africa? Well, prior to the 1800s, Europeans knew very little of Africa beyond the coastline. They had been doing slave trading, which was wrong, but that was along the coastline, so a lot of Europeans aren't actually going into the continent of Africa. And the person who changes this is a man named Dr. David Livingstone. He goes into Africa and he goes exploring, and a British journalist wants to do a story on him and tracks him down, and the British journalist is named Henry M. Stanley. And when Henry M. Stanley finds him in Africa, he writes basically about Livingstone and his experiences in the paper, and this just sets off this incredible firestorm of interest in Africa, and suddenly all of Europe wants to take a chunk of Africa for themselves. Is this greedy? Absolutely. Is this wrong? It sure is. But this is what happens. And they start to, after they publish their findings about the golds and riches in Africa, these powerful industrialized European countries are all going to start essentially tearing Africa apart and taking chunks of Africa for themselves. So, this is known as the Scramble for Africa. Between 1880 and 1914, many European countries lay claim to some portion of Africa. They'll take a chunk of it and say, this belongs to England, this belongs to Italy, Germany, Portugal, you name it. In 1885, 14 European countries meet in Berlin to partition or divide, carve up Africa into various colonies. Now, take a look at that for a second. In 1885, 14 European countries meet to decide who's going to get Africa. If we were in class together, this is when I would ask you all, who's not at this meeting? And one of you would raise your hand and you would say, anyone from Africa? Yeah, this is how ignorant and how just aggressive these European countries are. They all think that parts of Africa belong to them, even though there are millions and millions of people living in Africa at the time. So by 1914, 90% of the continent is under the control of some other European country. So this is the knowledge that people have of Africa, roughly in the 13 and 1400s, and you can see a vague outline of Africa. As they start to colonize, they start to map it out a little bit more. And then when we get to the 1850s, you can see the different regions that are claimed by different European countries. And by essentially the late 1800s, you can see the upper western part is French territory. You have the British area down in the south. You have Germany is owning a chunk of it down in the southwest. So you can see all these different places that have taken over. And if you notice, modern day African countries are still largely in part shaped by their previous colonial history. So I'm going to talk about the rest of the continent in terms of north, south, central, west, east, and I'm only going to highlight one or two little things from each of these different regions of Africa because Africa is really, really big. So In North Africa, the thing that I would want you to remember is that most of North Africa is the Sahara Desert, but there are a lot of people that live along the thin strip of land that is on the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. So there are a lot of people and cities that live along the coastline, even though the interior of the Northern Africa is Sahara Desert. And in terms of imperialism, it's really controlled a lot by the French and the British. Those are the two things you're going to need to know. The geography is mostly desert, plus a very vibrant culture and community along the coastline, and the French and the British take that over. In West Africa, the thing that you need to know is that the Portuguese, Dutch, and British all took different chunks of this for themselves. One interesting country that carves itself out during this time period is called Liberia, and it is founded in the year 1847. And it is founded by former African American slaves. Essentially, there was a program that at one point freed African slaves in the United States that wanted to go back to Africa could, and they set up their own country called Liberia. To this day, Liberia and the United States share a friendship, a kinship, because that is kind of like a small sister country of ours in Africa. So that is just one interesting note. In East Africa, the thing that I really want you to know is that the one country that keeps itself free almost the entire time of imperialism is Ethiopia. Ethiopia does not go under the control of any foreign power during this time. In South Africa, the thing that I really want you to walk away with knowing is that it's really the British that take over South Africa. First, it's the Dutch for a little while, but really the British are the ones that take over South Africa, which is why today in South Africa, although they do speak Afrikaans and Zulu, the other most common language in South Africa is actually English.